Hello everyone and welcome to the screencast on drafting your EPQ report. We're moving from the planning stage to the drafting stage now. You should all have finished your mid-project review, finalized your title, and be well into the writing now. What do I want to cover today? I'm looking at key dates, I'm looking at the mid-project review again, talking very quickly about introductions. I'm going to talk about centralizing argument in your report. I'm going to talk about the value of signposting and telegraphing. I'm going to be covering the importance of mini conclusions, subheadings that fit together with this idea of transitions and coherence. And this chain that I put in the slide is not simply to decorate the slide, but to remind you that arguments should not have broken rings in the chain. The chain has to be concatenated, it has to be bound together, and this is what a lot of my talk today is going to be about, making sure that your arguments work and that they're smoothly structured. Then I'm going to touch on conclusions and the importance of answering the question, and finally move on to the plenary. So what are the dates that you need to know about? Well, first of all, you need to know the end of term is fast approaching. In the final week, I will be available if you are in the vicinity to help you make sure that you go into the summer holiday knowing exactly what it is that you need to do. In order to remain on the EPQ, as I've said all along this year, you will have to have a minimum of 2,000 words. If you have not reached this, then I will be contacting your parents and suggesting that it would be a good idea for you to drop the EPQ, because it's not likely that you will finish. When you're back in September, and this is perhaps the most important thing of all, in the first week, by the end of the first week, I will be checking that a draft of your EPQ, the full 5,000 words of a report, or the full artifact report plus the artifact, has gone to the supervisor. If this is not the case, then you will not be allowed to have a UCAS grade. I want to remind you of this because that is a rule of UCAS itself. That is not an internal rule of our school. As soon as you hand in your draft, you will begin preparation of your presentation, and the presentations will be in early October. Your supervisor will give you some general feedback, and you may also ask me to have a little look at it as well. This is usually verbal feedback, and you'll be looking to redraft the report and make it much, much better. You'll have lots of checklists, you'll have a class with me, so you'll have the opportunity of refining and editing it and handing it in by the end of October. And then you will complete the final part of Project Q, which is the summary and the reflection. And then all EPQs must be into me by November. We will bind them, do the final touches, they will then be marked and moderated, and you will have your marks in January, and there will be an appeals process at that time if you feel that it is necessary. Now, in terms of the production log now, you should all have finished the planning review, and that should be locked. I would like to make sure by the end of the year that you have seen your supervisor, discussed your mid-project review in detail, spoken about the presentation that you did in classes and the feedback that you received, making sure that you discuss why this is the final artifact purpose or the final report question, research question, and really showing that you've discussed this with your supervisor. So I'll be writing to supervisors asking them to take real care at this stage, because we cannot change the titles after this. I'll remind you on my YouTube channel that there's a long video explaining why the mid-project review is really important. Now, if you want an A or an A star, you must be writing somewhere between 800 to 1,000 words for these entries in Project Q. Remember, if anything, Project Q is more important than the report itself because it details all of your thinking. Everything that I say today is on my YouTube channel. So you can find a long video on structuring the EPQ report. There's a video on the introductions to the EPQ report. There's another video on paragraph writing and the different types of paragraphs, and a lot about coherence and transitions that I'm going to talk about today. And finally, there's a whole video on conclusions. If you are doing an artifact, there is no need to watch any more of this video. You know that I've created an artifact video for you, and there are also many, many superb examples of artifact reports on the SharePoint. There are also excellent screencasts that have been made by 7 students showing you how they structured their artifact report. These are wonderful exemplars. Please use them and learn how to structure the report to make sure that you get the best out of the assessment criteria. Now, moving on, going back to those students doing an EPQ report, in terms of the introduction, I just want to remind you how important it is that you define key terms and key topics and provide some really key context. We want introductions of no more than 500 words, so they have to be pretty sharp. I also think it's very important that you remember at the center of the introduction must be an argument. So this report will be looking at this point of view, X versus Y. That will establish a very clear sense of purpose. I also remind you how important it is to signpost the structure of the report in the introduction. Now, going back to this idea of having an argument at the center, once again, I have 2 swords crossed because I want you to remind you that the report needs to be a battle, a contest, an evaluation, a weighing up of views. Avoid excessive description. Do not give me lots of facts. That's why we never allow the command words explain or describe. And in fact, I don't usually like the term how either. So how do you make sure that there is an argument at the center of your report? Well, there are a number of tactics that I teach. Firstly, throughout the report, you can refer to opponents and proponents. Opponents of video games. Proponents of video games say this. It will then be structured like a debate with different parties speaking against one another. Similarly, we can use the idea of advocates versus critics, advocates of gambling, critics of gambling. We can also use the idea of traditionalists versus revisionists, conservatives versus progressives. What was the old way of thinking versus what is the new way of thinking? That's another way of making sure that there's an argument, that there's a dialectic at the center of the report. We can also use the idea of optimists versus pessimists. I have an excellent report that I'm going to look at in a moment that looks at AI and talks about optimists of AI, the people who are going to advocate for it, versus the pessimists who see jobs being taken away from people, etc. And of course, if you're doing a more scientific or social science or psychology style EPQ, you can use the idea of the biological model versus the constructivist model, the idea of genetics versus the idea of the socialization. Please remember, I asked you to have an argument table. This is something you could discuss with your supervisor. An argument table is excellent because it makes sure that there's a genuine debate at the center of the report. If you have such a table, have it next to you as you are writing the report, and that will avoid large sections of description and explanation. Now, another way of ensuring debate is to make sure that you have a lot of sentences that show why there are opponents and what do these opponents believe. Have a look at this particular example here. Here's a good example of how to begin a section or a paragraph with a contrast of views. Whilst proponents of the originalist position on the American Constitution insist that, their opponents advocate for a living constitution. Next. Optimists such as, and I'll save somebody, insist that AI will be beneficial for the economy because pessimistic views are highly critical of this view. Flynn, 2023, for example, contests the view that he argues that optimists have overstated the benefits of AI by. So I've included these sentence stems to remind you that this contest of views, this clash of views, must be at the center of each of the sections and at the center of many of the paragraphs too. Now, signposting. I'm sure that you've heard from your English and history teachers over and over again that we must look at the question, look at the task. In terms of our school, we have sweaty paragraphs with the yes always being a guarantee that we are addressing the question. Now, here is a particular EPQ with the research question: should the advertising of gambling in sport be banned? Excellent question, because it absolutely requires an argument. And I wanted you to see here, this comes from the introduction. Sections 1 and 2 aim to contextualize the problem at hand, corroborating the risk and benefit to public health the advertising of gambling in sport poses, highlighting its growing prevalence in society to create a foundation for why intervention is needed. Finally, Section 3 concludes with a consideration of prior evaluation and a further evaluation of the issue. 3 things I like about this. Firstly, the clear signposting of the sections in the introduction. I've told most of you that I like 3 to 4 sections or chapters that will be the 3 to 4 different stages of your debate. Secondly, I like the use of connectives like finally, and these should be occurring right throughout your report to glue the argument together. Finally, I want to really highlight the use of the word evaluation, because good EPQs have lots of source evaluation, argument evaluation, and not description. When you're evaluating, you're saying how good or how bad something is. It calls for judgment, it calls for critique, and it calls for comparison with other schools of thought. So please ensure that you have not only the verb evaluate at the center of your writing, but that you are, in fact, genuinely evaluating. And I've made other videos, as you know, on how to critically evaluate sources. I cannot tell you how important it is to have many conclusions. This is a 5,000-word report. It is not an essay in English or history or politics or whatever. Because it's 5,000 words, because it will be structured into sections, you will be required to provide mini conclusions as you finish a section of the report. And these mini conclusions will go back to the research question, and they will signpost that research question, and they will sum up why that section of the report is significant and how it pertains to the research question. Here's a case in point. It is crucial to understand the pathological and problematic gambling poses a risk to public health and imposes both private and societal costs. But healthy and monitored gambling levels can boost individuals' welfare and foment growth within economies. And as you see here, I've written on target because it goes back to this research question here very clearly. Then we have the next subheading, and I'm going to talk a bit more about subheadings in a moment, so that you can see there is a neat transition between the sections of the report. Now, signposting and telegraphing. Telegraphing is when you really make it clear and you show your reader or examiner that you are on point, sharply focused on the research question. And as I say here, the words of the question should be threaded, I think that's the key term, throughout I should have the report. And here's a very good case in point. This report is entitled AI-based surveillance, an invisible hand towards a greater good or the end of freedom. Now, the key thing here is when you have a complicated research question like this, you must like the words that you've chosen. So he's using the metaphor of the invisible hand or the idea of a greater good. So I am going to expect these words to appear throughout the report, and indeed they do. I've chosen some sections. I will also put this report, an excellent A-star report, into the folder on Teams so that you can see it. And what we've done is we've highlighted every time he touches and signals the question. Look at the first bit. Data from reliable sources such as articles, research reports, and case studies have been used to determine whether AI-based surveillance is an invisible hand towards a greater good or the end of freedom. That's in the introduction. This comes from the middle section. Critics may use recent reports that have emerged claiming that AI-based surveillance is being used to profile and persecute entire minority groups. And he says here, AI-based surveillance is the end of freedom rather than an invisible hand towards good. And later he says, proponents of AI-based surveillance would use this evidence to suggest that AI-based surveillance is the invisible hand. And indeed, I just looked at his conclusion, the entire conclusion is focused on this particular research question. So important to thread all of these phrases that come from the title through the report so that people can see you are sharply focused throughout. Now, when you come to the end of a section, we talked a little bit about these mini conclusions, it's very important to explain exactly why it is so important to the reader. I'm just correcting the spelling there. The benefits of AI-based surveillance can be overlooked or minimized with the predictive policing, facial recognition, and GDS playing a crucial role in making the world a better and safer place. It is clear, when used for goods, the possibilities are almost endless. So this is going on the side of it being good. Proponents would use the way in which AI-based surveillance is being used in liberal democracies to suggest that the technology, while it has certain risks, can and is going a long way in safeguarding society. This is strong evidence which seems to reinforce the argument that AI surveillance is an invisible hand towards the greater good rather than the end of freedom. But look how well he ends here. However, critics would use the fact that technology does have flaws to decrease the strength of this argument. So as he came to the end of that section, really evaluating the argument, showing the positive of the proponents, but at the same time showing that there is this space for the critics to remain there. That's excellent practice for your EPQ reports. Now, subheadings are very, very important, but the key thing is not to have too many of them and to make sure that they are sharply focused on your question. Another thing is that you need very clear and careful transitions and transitional phrases, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment, between the sections, so the report is not fragmented. We want a flowing report with a connected argument. Now, citations are absolutely key, and you should get this as much as possible into your first draft. Please watch my other videos on citations and referencing. Look how excellent this is. And every page is like this. You do not have to use footnotes if you don't want to, but if you are using footnotes, this is what a good EPQ looks like. Canadian Journal of Psychiatry, okay? The importance of needs and uses of gratification theory. Notice journals, higher level theoretical papers, public effects of gambling, etc., and beautifully referenced. So this, again, this report will appear in your team's folder. This report shows really high-level reading, engagement with sources, sources used to support ideas, and very good critical evaluation of the sources too. Now, transitions, I put a little table up here just to remind you how important it is to glue your work together. And here's some phrases I'd like to remind you of. It can thus be seen that. A fair conclusion would be that, to summarize or to conclude. It is therefore difficult to dispute that. Another little typo there, correcting. Then there are also lots of transitional phrases that move a report forward, that don't only sum up something. Next, the report. The following section of the report will. So you can actually indicate what's going to follow next. So you can use all of these transitions to sum up the importance of things and then to move the report on to the next stage. Signaling and coherence. So as you all know, cohere is stick together. Make sure you're using lots of phrases that allow the reader to navigate and see where you're going. This report will explore. This will be discussed in greater detail below. This debate will be covered earlier. This debate was covered earlier in this report. Returning to the question of racial profiling. So all of these phrases bind and they make arguments work so that readers can see the different thread of your argument. It's easier to follow. So please use them and make sure that this report is coherent. Finally, conclusions. I told you I would come back to this report. This is the one about AI, and this is how it concludes. By examining real-world data from around the globe, this report has attempted to objectively answer the question, is AI-based surveillance an invisible hand towards the greater good? Does the prospect of catching criminals and reducing crime using AI justify the clear aims and objectives are being met in this conclusion? He's gone back to his introduction where he said, I'm setting out to do this, and now he is showing that he is arriving at an answer. So in your conclusion, answer the question, synthesize the report, bring the report together, the different sections. You could critique your own findings and say, there are lots of things that haven't been covered. Don't forget it's desirable to show that you are aware of some of the deficiencies and absence of your report. Nobody in 5,000 words can cover everything. And above all, show the significance of the debate. Both the reports that I've dealt with today, the one on gambling, the one on AI, they both show why this report matters and why this debate matters and why you should be engaged in this particular moral, ethical, and technological question. So finally, we come to the end. We come to our plenary. Please remember, argument, not description. Question focus. Signposting all of the time. Structure is absolutely key. Mini conclusions are key to showing the significance of different sections of the report. Transitions between sections of the report will avoid the report reading as being fragmented. And finally, in the conclusion, answer the question. Make sure that you achieve the purpose of the report. If it's an artifact, make sure that you evaluate and decide whether your artifact is fit for purpose, whether you achieved your purpose. Now, I hope that this was useful for you. Please do your best as you're drafting these reports. The better the first draft, the less pain in redrafting. Good luck, EPQ students. I wish you joy on this particular course. It is a very difficult thing for a 17 or 18-year-old person to do, but believe me, if you do it well, it will help you at university, and that is where the EPQ really matters in my eyes, and all the research supports that point of view as well. Best of luck.